Good morning guys, I'm Alex and welcome to this third devlog episode. If you're new to this series, we're working on a game in which the player will be able to create his own world by collecting resources, completing objectives, and building stuff. This week, we're going to cover a new major feature of the game, which are the influence zones. These zones will be used to limit the actions the player can do in the world. Oh, and also, we've decided to rotate the camera by 45 degrees to make the game a lot more interesting. But there's not much to say on that topic, since it was pretty easy to implement, and we didn't have any major issue doing this. Anyways, let's go back on the main subject. We wanted to be able to limit the speed at which the player can explore and interact with the world. Otherwise, there will be nothing to prevent him to just give up on his current village and just go start a new life somewhere else. Or even worse, the player could just go around in the world, sell everything that he finds, and complete all the objectives right away. And 5 minutes later, all the chests will be looted, all the NPC will be freed, and the player will simply be a rich master with an army of minions. Which is obviously something we don't want to have. How did we create these zones? Well, we started with a handful of sphere triggers placed around the level, and made sure that the objects react to them. Which gave us our first problem. The objects were considered to be inside the zone as soon as they touch it. I mean, the mechanic works, but I think it will look way better if they needed to be completely inside the zones. So we added a bunch of extra collisions to the objects and then tested to make sure that all of them were inside the zones. Okay, now we have a mechanic that works pretty great. We just have to make it a little bit prettier for the player. My first instinct was to use a post-process material, as it will affect the whole scene. So that's what we did, and then we added a screen space circle and then desaturated everything that was outside of that circle. But it's still not perfect. If we zoom in, we can see that the circle isn't really aligned with the spheres anymore. This is because our camera isn't perfectly perpendicular with the ground. So we had to change our technique a little bit, and use the world coordinates instead to generate the spheres. Okay, now that the circles are perfect, we can remove that ugly yellow circle. Thanks for your help, but we don't need you anymore. The next step was to give that circle some friends. To do that, we used the material parameter collections, with a bunch of vectors in it. And then we hooked all that up in the shader. The material code isn't really pretty anymore, but let's forget about it. You know, as long as it works, it doesn't really matter anyway. At this point, I realized a few things. First, the transition looks really cool when an object goes from colored to black and white. But as cool as it looks, it doesn't really represent the gameplay I want to have. For now, with this transition, if the player drags an object out of his area of influence, it looks like the object isn't interactable anymore, which is not the case. And also, I don't really want to use a post-process, as it can be pretty expensive for mobile devices. So, to fix these issues, we decided to remove the post-process and apply the shader to the ground only. Then, we made that the objects are handling their own transition based on if they are interactable or not. This way, it's easier to identify which objects are interactable and which are not. Okay, now that it works, let's try to make it even prettier. The main thing that bothered me with this iteration was all that object popping when they enter or leave the zones. So instead of using a simple bool to handle the transition, we made it smoother with the timeline. Then I was thinking about how sad the circles were and how we could potentially improve them. But even though we had a bunch of interesting results during our test, none of them really made me happy. So we just gave up on that for now. But we were still able to have a big improvement on the borders by simply adding a cylinder mesh around the circles. This simple addition helped defining the limits of the influence zones, and I really liked the way it looked. We tried to push this cylinder idea even further, but after a ton of failed tests, we reverted back to the initial idea. Which is not bad, I still really like the result. I just have that feeling that we can make it a little bit better. What do you think? Do you have any suggestions? Anyway, I didn't want to stay stuck on that any longer, since there was a couple of last steps I wanted to do for this devlog. The first one was to constrain the camera to the influence zones. The objective behind this idea is to increase the exploration and progression feelings a little bit, and this was a pretty simple feature to implement. But we just had to polish it a little bit to make sure that the movement was smooth, which we achieved by identifying the closest influence zone and then simply lerping towards it. Here we go, we have a nice and smooth gravitational feeling. And it also gives the player the possibility to jump between zones if they are close enough to each other. The last thing I wanted to do this week is to give the possibility to place the zones like any other objects. So we simply moved all the code into a new kind of buildable object. In the final game, the player will not have the possibility to build or destroy any influence statues, only moving them. But it's going to be good enough for now. When placing the first statue, I noticed that the player was able to place it wherever he wanted. This is happening because the statue was using his own influence zone, hence cancelling any utility of this mechanic. We fixed this by disabling the zone when the actor is selected. But then, since this also disabled the zone's visual, we had to tweak the shader code a little bit to create a kind of preview mode. And voila, I guess that completes this first iteration of the influence zone system. Stay tuned for the next devlog, in which we're probably going to add some NPCs in the game, which is going to make this game a little bit more alive. I really hope you like this new devlog format. I spent a lot of time polishing this one, and I'd really like to have your feedback. Please let me know what you think in the comments, or you can pass by our Discord server and give me your suggestions. And finally, about my streaming schedule. I've decided that I will only stream once a week, as I'm way more productive when I'm not. For the time and day, I was thinking about every Saturday at around 1 PM EST. We'll go from there and then we'll see how it goes. Anyways, thanks for watching, have a nice day and bye bye.